Well, hello and welcome to Goucher Environmental Dialogues. I'm Dr. Jen DeRosa. I'm the director of our Environmental Sustainability and Management program at Goucher College. And if this is your first time joining us, the Goucher Environmental Dialogues are a web-based speaker series. We feature cultivated conversations in environmental issues and topics, sustainability and climate. And I sit down typically and talk with leaders and visionaries and innovators working in these different disciplines. This series is hosted by Goucher College, our new master's degree program in environmental sustainability and management. And if you're interested, I'm also hosting an information session on March 12th. So about two months from now. I'm posting our link tree in the chat. So if you have any interest in future Goucher Environmental Dialogues, we have another one coming up at the end of February, or our information session about our master's degree program, or if you just want to follow us on social media, please check out our link tree. Now, our conversation today is about saving the Chesapeake Bay. Our guest is the president and CEO of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, Hilary Harp Falk. And Hilary serves as as I mentioned, as the president and CEO. She has previously held several executive leadership positions at the National Wildlife Federation. And before these national roles, she led the National Wildlife Federation's Mid-Atlantic Regional Center, including programs on wildlife conservation, coastal resiliency, water policy, greenhouse gas reduction, and education. She's an expert in large-scale ecosystem restoration and coalition building, and she created and directed the Choose Clean Water Coalition, a 230-member advocacy organization that's focused on protecting the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And so if you'll join me for a second, since we're a webinar and you can't turn on your camera or mic, you can use the chat. So if you'll join me in the chat by giving a warm welcome to Hilary. Please indicate in the chat where you're logging in from, because we typically have people logging in from all over. It's different states, different countries. And if you have any questions during my conversation with Hilary, please ask them in the chat, and I will try to give voice to them in the middle to the end of our conversation. All right, thank you for doing that. Now to start, welcome, Hilary. I'd like to just start with a general question. Can you tell me or us, our listeners, how the Chesapeake Bay is unique when it comes to conservation?
Well, Jen, thank you so much for having me today, and I'm loving the chat, watching the chat, and seeing where folks are from. So it's an honor for me to get to join you today, and I'm excited to talk all about saving the Bay. So the Chesapeake Bay is a really unique place. For those of you who have studied the Bay know it's the largest estuary in North America and the third largest estuary in the world. But one of my favorite facts about the Chesapeake Bay is actually about its land to water ratio. The Chesapeake Bay spans 6 states in the District of Columbia, starts all the way up in Cooperstown, New York, and goes as far west as the Shenandoahs and then down into Virginia Beach. And the fact is that the land to water ratio for the Chesapeake Bay is 14-1, which is really unheard of around the world. Do you think about all of those 64,000 square miles, all those states, all those farms, towns, and cities, all flowing into the little place we lovingly know as the Chesapeake Bay? It's a really large and vast watershed, and it also makes saving the Chesapeake Bay and in particular, restoring the rivers and streams that flow into the bay, all that more challenging.
I like your description of that, because I remember when I was an oceanography student a long time ago, and we learned that Chesapeake Bay was a flooded estuary, so it essentially formed at the end of the last ice age. But I've never really heard it described in terms of the land to water ratio, and that helps me better appreciate the Chesapeake Bay. But I imagine with that in mind, there's a lot of challenges associated with trying to protect it. So could you speak to some of those challenges that are associated with trying to protect it and going even further and trying to restore it?
Yes, absolutely. And one of the other fun facts about the Bay is that while folks hear about the deep water trench within the Bay, most of the Bay is really, really shallow. Your average NBA or WNBA player could walk across much of the Chesapeake Bay. And so not only is it a small little puddle in the end of that really big watershed, but it's a really shallow place. And that makes it really vulnerable to a bunch of the issues that we're going to talk about today. One of the biggest challenges is all of that land and the pollution on all that land coming into the Chesapeake Bay. For a long time, we've been focused on three major issues: nitrogen, sediment, and phosphorus, which all run off the land and end up in the bay. And those can cause all sorts of different challenges by lowering the dissolved oxygen, which living resources like crabs and fish need. It blocks out sunlight to underwater grasses and hurts habitat. And we know that climate change and issues of warming, sea level rise, coastal storms, all of that is contributing to more pollution or more intense issues, pushing that pollution off the land and into the water.
That's really fascinating to hear all of the different issues. And I think I was listening to NPR the other day, and they were also talking about saltwater intrusion too, being an issue in the mouth of the bay. And that was one that I hadn't previously considered as well. So hearing all of these issues, I know it can be kind of complicated for listeners to, when they're learning about the bay, to try and wrap their mind around all these different issues. I know that, so I live on an island in the middle of the bay, and we often hear on the news or in the radio that the bay is assigned a letter grade, like I think it's once a year, in terms of being its state of the bay. Can you tell us more about how the bay is monitored and how it's assessed to receive that grade?
Absolutely. And, one of the neat things about the Chesapeake Bay, it's one of the most studied water bodies in the world. So we know a lot about the Chesapeake Bay. And at CBF, we get that question a lot: how is the bay doing? And so the Chesapeake Bay Foundation years ago started the State of the Bay report to try to answer that question and help people see every 2 years how the Chesapeake Bay is doing based on a set of indicators. This last State of the Bay report was from 2022, and the Chesapeake Bay received a D plus. So not exactly a grade that you want to bring home to mom, but certainly a improving score and something that we're watching as we try to continue to improve the health of the Chesapeake Bay, the living resources, and stop the pollution entering the bay. With some bad news in that report, we are also seeing some good news. And I think one of the most exciting stories of the last couple of years, and I would say probably the story of the decade for the Chesapeake Bay, is how successful oyster restoration has been and continues to be as we look in new and creative ways to bring our favorite bivalve back and really put it to work as an important part of cleaning the water in the Chesapeake Bay.
That's exciting to hear. And I was thinking also in terms of the state of the bay and the grade that's assigned from an environmental communication perspective, it's very effective because, it takes, from what I've seen of the reports and looking at them personally, it takes all of these dimensions and it breaks it down in a way that's very understandable for the public, which I think is very important as well. I was going to ask, how is protecting and restoring the bay coming along over the last 5 years? And I think you might have spoken to that a bit. Or maybe I should sort of broaden that out: 5 years, 10 years. How is it doing? I know hearing a D is is a little cringy. You're right. As a mom, if my kids brought that home, I'd be like, what's going on? So in the nuances of the state of the bay, though, how is it coming along?
Well, I think, in the big trajectory, we have seen major progress on cleaning up the Chesapeake Bay. A lot of that has because of wastewater treatment upgrades and 40 years of effort to educate stakeholders around the Chesapeake Bay and to really make the case for policies that would reduce pollution entering the bay. Over the last decade, the Chesapeake Clean Water Blueprint has been a defining feature of Chesapeake Bay restoration, and that is a construct that really serves to remove the Chesapeake Bay from EPA, Environmental Protection Agency's dirty waters list. So we want to get the Chesapeake Bay and all of its tributaries off that dirty waters list. And back in 2009, this was created after many different Chesapeake Bay agreements that were more voluntary had not reached sort of the level of success that we knew was required. And so we've been following the Chesapeake Clean Water Blueprint since 2009 and have seen a lot of success from that. The current deadline to remove the Chesapeake Bay from the dirty waters list is 2025. What we know is that we will not be successful by that deadline, but many good things are happening in each of the Chesapeake Bay states, and as the collective, the Executive Council, which manages the Chesapeake Bay, many of the Bay State governors sit on this group that helps really think about commitments to Chesapeake Bay across all of the states, and working with the Environmental Protection Agency and other key agencies and the Chesapeake Bay Commission. And I think all of that has served the Bay really well because we're heading to this upcoming deadline and know that we won't get there. There has been a lot of conversation about what we've learned over the last 40 years and what needs to change in order to manage the Bay for the next 40 years.
That's good to hear that it's quite productive, especially with having the support of governors of the different Chesapeake Bay states. I know I'm going to get this question from somebody in the chat, so I thought I'd ask it now. What can the members of our audience are made up of students, undergrad, grad, faculty, but also just members of the general public that are interested in this topic. What can they do to help support the Chesapeake Bay Foundation's initiative and work that you're doing?
That's a great question, and one that I love, because while we are focused on the Bay, most people see the Chesapeake Bay from their local river and stream. Jen, you talked about from where you live. I live in Annapolis, so right near College Creek, and so I see the Bay from my local stream. And especially when we think about individuals who live in New York and Pennsylvania, a lot of them are thinking about water quality by their local river and stream. And so I think what anybody on this webinar or across the region can do is to really focus on that local stream, and because it's so important that we have clean and healthy rivers and streams for the people in the communities where they live. And we know also that by protecting those rivers and streams and stopping pollution entering those, that we will ultimately restore the Chesapeake Bay. I also love to talk to people about planting trees and growing oysters. I mean, these are two things that we can do. Not everybody has oysters nearby, but almost everybody can get trees in the ground. And we know that these have benefits for not only addressing water quality, but also looking at impacts of climate change. And so looking for those nature-based solutions that anybody can do in their backyard are so important. And the other thing is vote. We know that so many of our local officials have such a big impact on the environment in communities, at the county level, at the state level. So we need leaders calling for pollution reduction, calling for healthy rivers and streams, and so making sure that everybody knows that their vote counts at all of those different scales of government. So we can continue to work at it. And I think that really mirrors the way that we see things at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, where we always start with education, educating kids, talking to the next generation, learning about the Chesapeake Bay ecologically, also from a cultural standpoint, and then also advancing policy in the different state capitals as well as the federal government. And then finally, when we see people polluting, or we see especially companies polluting, holding companies accountable who are contributing or illegally polluting, making sure that we're addressing those through litigation.
I appreciate that, especially what you said earlier about everyone really focusing on their local component of the Chesapeake Bay. All of those small pieces add up to the larger whole in protecting the bay. And I feel like if anyone wants me to go out and plant some more native plants and trees, I'm all there. I love doing that. So that would be great. Um, in our graduate program, we do spend quite a lot of time talking about stakeholder engagement for the Chesapeake Bay, and you've mentioned some. For the Chesapeake Bay, who are the different stakeholders when it comes to saving and protecting and restoring the bay?
Yeah, well, I think at its greatest sense, it's the almost 19 million people that live in the watershed. But I think, more specifically, we always consider ways to engage um, farmers, watermen who are, out catching seafood and who know the bay really well. Um, those to me are some of the key stakeholders. I think anybody who lives in a community near the bay and who is having an impact on the bay or seeing or the benefits of the bay. And then finally, I think there are a lot of stakeholders who we haven't engaged very well, and I'm thinking especially communities that have been seen the impacts of environmental injustices and the siting of different power supply or been have water in their basement because of flooding. I think there are a lot of stakeholder groups that we need to get better at engaging and understanding how those injustices are impacting people's daily lives.
Is there an action plan to better engage those stakeholders, especially when it's really an environmental justice or climate justice concern?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's something that CBF is interested in, but organizations across the region are really focused on what are some of those direct impacts and how do we better support communities that are facing those injustices. A lot of that work at CBF is done through our litigation department and making sure that we're both in communities or working directly with community-based organizations when people are raising their hand and saying they're seeing something that's really not right.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. I mean, I mentioned to you before we started our webinar, I live on Kent Island in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay, and there's regions that they flood very, very frequently, and it's noticeably changing over the last 10 years, the increased flooding that we've been having. So I appreciate those efforts. I'm a bit of a policy wonk, so I have to ask this question. How does environmental policy and litigation feature into CBF's work? You touched on this a bit earlier, but I wanted to go a little deeper.
Yeah, so I think I talked a little bit about litigation, and usually that's starts with a phone call to one of our attorneys or a member of the team that's working in a community to say, I see something, I don't think this is right, could you come check it out? And so a lot of it is, we have priorities as it relates to litigation and making sure we're holding polluters accountable and also the commitments that have been made, all of the states and the EPA, everybody has a role to play in accountability. And so litigation, we see that as that sort of final accountability mechanism. But a lot of our work is actually in the policy realm. And in that way, we're working with legislators, primarily in Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, to understand where the weaknesses in the policy framework exist now and how we might advance some of those ideas in the future. And so one example right off the top of my head, we're working right now with a state senator and delegate in the state of Maryland to bring something called the whole watershed approach to legislation and support that legislation to get it passed. And it's a really neat look at some of the evolving science that we're seeing coming out of the bay on how to take these smaller segments of rivers and streams off EPA's dirty waters list. And the idea is, in this case, that Maryland will pick 5 different watersheds and will prioritize those 5 places and really focus on resources and support to community-based organizations, agencies, and a really cross-cutting approach to targeting some of those places that need the most help, and to make sure that it gets the resources, science, and really investment that are going to remove those places from the dirty waters list. And so that legislation will be introduced this session. So real time example, but we're really excited because the bill sponsors have been working so deliberately in partnership with all of the stakeholders in the area, and especially with some of the conservation organizations, to take science that we're seeing evolve and lessons learned and to put it into practice. Those legislative sessions, especially in Maryland and Virginia, are quite a sprint. And I was just in Richmond 2 weeks ago, walking the halls, talking to key leaders in Virginia about the importance of oysters and trees, work on legislation that will a bill that would focus on outcomes, on not just more investment across Virginia, but how do we get pay for outcomes in conservation in within the state. And so that work is all throughout the year, but concentrated right now on something that we think is a really great way to get things done.
That's exciting. So we'll be able to follow that legislation as it's moving through the General Assembly. That's exciting to hear. Do you find in working in CBF, working with these proposed bills, that there tends to be quite a bit of bipartisan support for them? Most of us live in and around the Bay, so I would imagine, since things are in our backyard, it's something that would be easy to kind of reach across the aisle for.
Yeah, and the neat thing about Chesapeake Bay as an issue is that it has been bipartisan from day one. I think sometimes, different legislators of different parties see different strategies to get to the same goal, but I think we really appreciate that we see support across the aisle, and are looking for ways to bring consensus proposals forward. Sometimes that's not possible, we know. Sometimes and in some issues it's really challenging, but it's certainly, I haven't met a legislator who says they don't like oysters or crabs, and certainly not one who says they don't like clean water.
That's good to hear. Yeah, especially that there's a shared vision and goal there. And, when you're working with a lot of people, there's going to be a lot of ideas of how to get there, but that's good to hear. Before I ask my next question, I just wanted to remind anyone who joined us late, if you have any questions for Hilary, feel free to type them in the chat, and I will give voice to it in just a little bit. Just so as a reminder, you're welcome to do that. So you had also mentioned earlier, CBF is involved in quite a bit of education and outreach. How does that feature in CBF's mission and work, and what type of, how do you guys go about doing the education and outreach?
So this is a great question, and I'm also going to reveal an earlier, my first job at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. So back in 2001, I was hired as an environmental educator at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and I was able to live on part of Tangier Island, on a separate island called Port Isabel, which the Chesapeake Bay Foundation owns and operates as an education center. And a huge part of what the Chesapeake Bay Foundation does is educate the next generation of leaders, and cultivates those leaders through high school and college. I get the benefit of kind of running into different individuals who went through education programs at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation who are now adults. But as environmental education from that time, and also just I think as part of the role that the Chesapeake Bay Foundation plays, I can't think of a better way to impact the future than getting kids the knowledge that they need about the natural environment and the incredible experience of being outside on the bay. So we operate education programs all over the watershed, and this year is our 50th anniversary of environmental education. We've educated well over 1 million students just to get kids outside. And I think, I think some of our members really want to see those results immediately, the litigation, the policy wins. But for folks that are really interested in the long game, I would put environmental education as sort of one of the top things that we can do. And also, when I talk to students who are passionate about this work, I feel so great about the future because I know that it's not just resting with the 200 staff at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation or our members, but really the next generation is so keyed in, understands the connection between saving the bay and addressing the climate crisis, and is just unafraid of bold ideas. So I get pretty passionate about our environmental education work and just the potential of working with the next generation.
That's exciting to hear. I know that my kids they're teenagers, but they've spent their life, I think, in the K through 12 system, interacting in many different ways with the Bay and with CBF and doing different programs and field trips. So it's exciting to hear that. I know that, and also I know many of our listeners are very passionate about environmental education too. I should ask this before I move on to my next question is, for those that are listening that are interested in getting more involved with CBF, do you have environmental education internships that would be available?
So we have a number of internships at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. Our intern program is one of our favorite parts of CBF. It's also where I got my start, so I'm a big fan of those programs. So you can always check our website, cbf.org, for the latest on that. We also do a lot of volunteer days. If you do have water access, which I know is limited on the Bay, you can grow oysters for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. We also have tree plantings. We own and operate a farm in Upper Marlboro, Maryland, and regularly have events there. And so there's no shortage of ways to get involved. And the best place to learn about that is either social media or on our website.
Oh, good. Well, I'll make sure when I send out our recording at the end of this, I will include a link to your website for anyone who's interested in more. So turning more specifically to you personally, what led you to this career that you have, leading the largest conservation organization that's dedicated to Chesapeake Bay?
Well, I grew up in Baltimore, not far from the college, and got the chance to spend a lot of my childhood outside. My father was the Sunday Sun magazine photographer at the Baltimore Sun when it had a pretty robust Sunday magazine, and I got the chance to tag along with him on stories. And his favorite stories and mine were the ones on the Chesapeake Bay. And so I ended up driving with him all around the watershed, taking pictures primarily of people in places. And it was just some of my very favorite memories growing up. And so if you had asked me at 8 what I was going to do with my career, I would have told you it was in working on the Chesapeake Bay. And I have been so fortunate to get to do that. My first internship was with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. And then was able, after I worked at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, to go back to school. I got a master's degree from the University of Vermont, really realizing that as passionate as I was about environmental education, I really wanted to also look at policy and other ways of working on environmental issues, and spent some time at a small think tank in DC. Learned a lot as a ghostwriter for different papers on large-scale ecosystem restoration, and especially writing ghostwriting appropriation requests that made their way up to the Capitol Hill on some of America's other great waters, the Great Lakes, the Mississippi River Delta, the Delaware, Long Island Sound. And there's no shortage of really remarkable places. When the National Wildlife Federation was opening a regional center, I jumped in on that and got to work on climate change and other key issues for wildlife in the Mid-Atlantic, and had a fantastic 13 years at National Wildlife Federation doing a host of different jobs, especially working out west, which is a very different environmental context than the East, thinking about big landscapes, wildlife. In that case, a lot of water scarcity, not just water quality. But a little over 2 years ago, I was able to come back to the Chesapeake Bay and lead the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, which is quite a dream, and ended up back here. So had a bit of a meander there at the National Wildlife Federation, but learned a ton of really neat, really great conservation work across the country, and just a remarkable set of people and places.
That's wonderful to hear, and I think many good careers they're not straight. They're full of great meanders that help build those skill sets. You mentioned starting out helping with taking photos of the bay. Do you still take photos?
So I still take photos, and I still tag along with my dad. And he's done several books and several documentaries, and I still love to tag along with him. And maybe more importantly, I now have two kids of my own, my two sons who are 10 and 12, and they absolutely love being out on the bay, and especially on Smith Island and Tangier, where I spend a lot of my time at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. And so they now love to tag along with me to work, and appreciate the Bay and their time on it. So I get the chance now to pass it along to the next generation.
That's wonderful to hear. Yeah, I appreciate that. Since I have a number of graduate students in our program who've joined, what advice would you look back on your younger self, just starting out, or what recommendations would you give to those that are interested in building a similar career in saving the environment?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think the first thing is it's a great place to spend a career. And so I hope whether it is your full-time career or you're volunteering, as for a local watershed organization, I would just say stay in the fight, because it's a really fun place to work. It's also can be challenging, but I think the good days certainly outweigh the bad ones. I would also look for internships. I know I mentioned them, and Jen, you mentioned them, but what a great way to learn about an organization or an issue than being an internship. I think we're also, as a community, getting better at equity in internships and making sure that we can do as many internships as possible paid, so that everybody can be part of that, or through fellowships and other means. And there's some great ways to do that, especially through partners at the Chesapeake Bay Trust, who run the Chesapeake Bay Corps. And I know President Biden is looking for more and more ways to get young people involved in different efforts through the Climate Corps. So internships. And then I would say also, I thought I would always work on the Bay, but going and working on Western conservation and learning butterflies and water recharge on public lands was just a fantastic education. So stay curious and open to sort of different paths. And also, maybe it's not the nonprofit field, but the for-profit world that you're interested. And I think there's so many businesses that are looking at ways to focus on environmental sustainability in government, or ESG priorities. And I think there's so many great businesses out there that we're partnering with, or who are partnering with other environmental or social impact groups, that there are ways outside of the nonprofit world to continue to stay in the fight and invest in the places and the organizations that are doing good work.
Oh, I love the advice that you gave, because I agree with you 100%. Just internships are a great way of exposing to different ideas, different passions, different skill sets, and as well, stay curious. I agree. Stay curious, because that you never know what you're going to discover that you want to continue to work on or lead. I reminded our audience that if they had any questions, please post them in the chat. So I'm going to say that one more time. If you have any questions for Hilary Falk, please post that in the chat. I see that we have a question from Ben. Ben said, you mentioned that a healthy Chesapeake Bay is a bipartisan issue. but there are strategic disagreements as to how to achieve that. What, in your experience, are some of the points of contention that you have seen come up?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it really depends on the issue, but I think a lot of it is about, um, you know, just at a very basic level, a regulatory framework or a voluntary one. And I think in the Chesapeake Bay history of the Chesapeake Bay, we've seen both. I would argue we need to do both. We need to incentivize the practices we know are going to improve water quality, and especially at a non-point source pollution, so pollution running off a single piece of land. We need to look at all ways to different ways to incentivize that. But at some point, we need regulation to really draw that line, and I think those regulations are so important to have and make sure that we are holding everybody accountable for clean water. And so I think you just see some differences. I think we also know that climate change is an issue that has not always been a bipartisan issue. I would argue that it should be, and is increasingly becoming a bipartisan issue, especially when we see the impact climate change is having on individuals, communities, and even military installations around the watershed. You know, it's hard to live in Norfolk and not really sort of internalize the impacts of climate change as we're seeing Norfolk change just dramatically. But depending on some of the issues, we see, I think, differences.
Yeah, I agree with that, and we often talk in our own groups here at Goucher about like the carrot versus stick approach to, and you know, incentives can be really good for motivating and jumpstart, but there's certain situations where you really just have to have
Gotta
that.
have it.
You got to have regulation
Yep.
because got to have the stick, you know, and finding that balance for the different stakeholders in and around the bay. We have another question from Tanner. What are some key lessons learned from other watersheds that Chesapeake Bay has been able to implement or is thinking of implementing?
Great question. So I think we are always looking for those science lessons. And I'll also say that this summer, a report came out on the Chesapeake Bay called the Comprehensive Evaluation of System Response. And it didn't look at all of the great things that the Chesapeake Bay effort has produced. It looked at all the ways that we could get better at what we're doing. And so I think some of those lessons are really relevant in other parts of the country where we're seeing too much pollution still entering our and sort of especially as it relates to fertilizer inputs and other inputs that are being put on the land that are coming outside of the watershed. But I think, you know, I think a lot about the Great Lakes, very different watershed, also restoration effort that's managed by the EPA. A lot of the Great Lakes issues have been around sediment and some of the toxic issues, and I think there's plenty to learn from them. They've also been learning from the Chesapeake Bay on the TMDL for Lake Erie. So I think there's a bunch of different places where we can kind of pass back and forth information. Some of the best scientists on the Bay are also looking at watersheds outside of the U.S., so places far away. But I think, as we all know, that the agriculture and the food system that we all live in, that's part of our daily life, has so much impact on the environment. There are a lot of different corollaries around the world that we're looking at and trying to figure out how to have a water system and an agricultural system that are not working in conflict, but rather working in concert.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That kind of what can we learn from other regions and watersheds that may be having similar issues. I had some colleagues when I lived in coastal Louisiana that they actually collaborated with the Netherlands because they had very similar issues with flooding, with land loss, and dead zones and things like that. So I think I'm hoping we'll continue to see more of that kind of collaboration and growth as we move into the future. We have another question from Lynn. Do you have any thoughts about the role of arts in advocating for the Bay?
What a great question. And, you know, I think it's one of the things that we're dreaming up for the future, and I'll say this with some trepidation, we have focused so much on the regulatory frameworks, the fill in your favorite acronym within the community, MS4 permits, or the TMDL, which is what the Chesapeake Bay Clean Water Blueprint is, all these different regulatory mechanisms, because we knew that they were really important, and somehow lost storytelling and the sort of creative aspects and the humanity of restoring the Chesapeake Bay. And I think that the arts could play a huge role, and already have. I see there have been some great art installations that I think can explain what's going on in the Bay better than any technical talk. And even some of the storm drains. I think some of like the storm drain artwork in Baltimore is so great at illustrating and having people connect in with this work in a way that's completely different than the way that other ways of connecting in. And so I'd love to see more and more people and art in our future.
That's lovely to hear. I have colleagues that work in the space of preserving culture, sustaining culture, but also I have another colleague at Hopkins who's done ethnographic work on Smith Island. And I know all of these varied communities that live around the Bay have so many fascinating stories to tell about how has it changed? What is their life like living in this area? And I think it's wonderful to hear that that's important to make sure that that's still in the conversation. We have another question from Beth. Would more farming in greenhouse gases help in some ways to prevent fertilizers and other chemicals from getting into the water sources since they are more contained? I'm not sure.
Farming in greenhouses.
Oh, sorry. Greenhouse. Sorry.
Yeah.
My vision is a little blurry today. Would
That's
more
okay.
farming in greenhouses help in some way to prevent fertilizers and other chemicals from getting into the water sources?
So I don't know the direct answer to that question, but I will say that ways that we're reducing fertilizer and chemicals are so essential to restoring the Chesapeake Bay. And I think there are all sorts of ways that we can work in partnership with farmers and other, members of the agricultural community to think about the sort of really in creative ways of making sure that we're not having more sort of pollutants entering the Bay. And one of the big takeaways from this report that I just mentioned from the summer is that even in places where we are making major progress on the Chesapeake Bay and we are putting in investments in everything from streamside buffers to manure management, those are the places where we're still seeing so much intensive practices and agricultural practices that they're offsetting. So we are on the, or as Senator Chris Van Hollen always loves to say, we are walking up the down escalator. And we've got to find a way to stop doing that, where we're just working harder and harder, but are still seeing more and more inputs to the system. And so one of the things that we're really trying to grapple with is what are those creative ways that we could stop having more inputs to the system? And we talk a lot at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation about regenerative agriculture, which is really agriculture that mimics nature. And so how can we bring more natural systems into this, because we know a well-maintained farm can do wonders for local streams and rivers. And so how can we make sure those farms stay farming, not turning into a subdevelopment or more impervious
Surfaces, right?
surfaces,
Yeah.
and really think about how we can continue these farming legacies, but do it in a way that's really supporting the farm and the environment around the farm.
That's really good to hear. And I imagine with some like regenerative ag or permaculture and different agricultural options that are on the table, to some extent, it might require a bit of a paradigm shift in terms of the agricultural industry. And that's, that's a challenge in and of itself. But I think most people that live in this region, they want to continue their way of life, but at the same point, they also want to make sure it's not having a terrible impact on the water and making sure that the water is clean. We have another question from Lynn, who says, I love the telling stories aspect. Are there any efforts underway to work with different ethnic groups, like Blacks of the Chesapeake, to provide resources for them to share their cultural experience, stories, living and working along the bay?
Absolutely. And I'll do a shout out to Blacks the Chesapeake, which is a fantastic foundation like CBF and is really focused on the Black history within the Chesapeake Bay. Vince Leggett is their founder, and he's a great speaker for future future speaker ideas. But I think there are so many important stories to tell, and I think about the so, some of the oystermen and oyster industry of the Chesapeake Bay, and those untold stories by Black watermen. I think about the indigenous stories of that are still surrounding our community. So I think there's more and more opportunity to share those stories and to promote the organizations that are day in and day out, talking about the cultural experiences on the Chesapeake Bay that may be different than the stories that we've told before.
That's lovely to hear, because I know that I've lived in other places throughout the U.S. and the history there is much shorter than here on the Chesapeake Bay. We even have a sign of the year of first settlement, and it's just amazing to me the length and depth of human history that we have in and around the bay, and sustaining and preserving those stories of all of the different groups that have lived here is very, very important. We don't have any other questions left in the chat, so I want to thank you, Hilary, so much for this really fascinating talk about the work you're doing and the work that the Chesapeake Bay Foundation is doing. I'm going to remind people that are listening, I will send out a recording probably by tomorrow. Got to give myself some time to edit that. I also want to have a special thanks to Taylor, who's been working in the background to make sure our events run smoothly. And since it is a webinar and we can't hear any applause, if you could give a virtual applause or thank you in the chat before we close out, that would be very, very nice. Just a reminder, our next Goucher Environmental Dialogues will come up on February 28th, so be on the lookout for future emails and social media about that. Thank you guys, and thank you, Hilary.
Thank you, Jen, so much. It was a pleasure.